Today, you'll learn English with the news. We'll read a news article on the conflict that continues between the US and Iran. Welcome back to JForrest English. Of course, I'm Jennifer. Now let's get started. Our headline, Trump says Iran talks will continue, but ceasefire is over. So notice here, these three words are in quotation marks. It means that these three words came out of the mouth of Donald Trump. And they're making this known because ceasefire is over is a strong statement. So the author is saying, this isn't my interpretation. These are the words that Donald Trump said. So these quotes serve an important purpose. Now let's go back here. Trump says Iran talks will continue. Here, talks is a noun. It represents formal negotiations. It's used in a government context. It's also used in a business context as well. Of course, talk is also a verb. She talks to her mother every day. Or Jennifer, I hope to talk to you one day, and I hope that as well. But in this context, it's not a verb, it's a noun. And the replacement would be Trump says Iran negotiations. If you wanted to replace it with another noun, negotiations will continue, but ceasefire is over. Don't worry about taking notes. I summarize everything in a free lesson PDF. You can find the link in the description. Now let's keep reading about this. Iran and the US, remember it's the US, this is an exception, one that many students forget. Even my students who live in the US as immigrants, they still say this incorrectly. Iran and the US have threatened. So the subject is they, because we have two countries, they have threatened. They have threatened. Notice our sentence structure. After threat, this is our verb to threat, to do something. This is when you say you're going to do something, generally if something else doesn't happen. So if you don't give me a promotion, I'll quit. So you just made a threat. Made a threat that would be the noun form. You just threatened to quit. So threaten to do something. And here the something is reignite. Ignite, we use this when you start a fire. You can ignite a fire. So you can imagine that the fire represents the conflict. Now, reignite is to start again. So when you add re in front of the verb, it means to do that action again. The action is ignite, which means to start. So you start a fire, but then the fire dies. So the fire goes out. So you have to reignite the fire. You have to start it again. So again, remember, the fire represents the conflict in this case. So threaten to reignite their conflict, to start the conflict again after the most extensive exchange of fire. So an exchange of fire would be Iran firing at the US and the US firing at Iran. So it's going back and forth, just like having an exchange with someone is a conversation that goes back and forth. But unfortunately, in this case, it's not a conversation. It's not an exchange of words or ideas. It's an exchange of fire. The most extensive exchange of fire. So notice our superlative. The most extensive. The superlative is the highest order. And remember, with the superlative, you need the most extensive. Now, some verbs in the, or some adjectives in the superlative, you add est, the greatest exchange of fire. So if great were the adjective, then you would add est. The most extensive exchange of fire since an interim deal was signed last month. So here we have since a deal was signed last month. So if you sign a contract or a deal, it means you officially agree to it. It becomes finalized. It becomes formalized. But here, an interim deal. Interim is a temporary deal until a permanent deal can be reached. So since an interim deal was signed last month. Now, this part is important because it gives you information about the superlative, the most extensive exchange of fire. Without this information, it would sound like of all time. But if you say since an interim deal was signed last month, now the superlative isn't since the beginning of time, it's since this action. Are you enjoying this lesson? If you are, then I want to tell you about the Finally Fluent Academy. This is my premium training program where we study native English speakers from TV, movies, YouTube, and the news so you can improve your listening skills of fast English, expand your vocabulary with natural expressions, and learn advanced grammar easily. Plus, you'll have me as your personal coach. You can look in the description for the link to learn more, or you can go to my website and click on Finally Fluent Academy. Now let's continue with our lesson. On a chaotic day at the NATO summit in Ankara, the pronunciation, notice chaotic, K, chaotic. So this is audic, chaotic. Chaotic is crazy, a lot happening. So we use this adjective a lot in our everyday. You could absolutely say today was crazy to represent many, many things going on, maybe a lot of stress, a lot of pressure, a lot of surprises. Today was chaotic. Now, today was chaotic, so to be chaotic, you could say today was a day, a chaotic day. So the adjective can come before the noun or after the verb to be. Here we have on a day at the NATO summit. Well, what type of day? On a chaotic day at the NATO summit in Ankara. On a chaotic day at the NATO summit in Ankara, Donald Trump said the U.S. would probably hit the country again on Wednesday evening. The country being Iran. The U.S. would probably hit. So would hit. This is for reported speech. Said the U.S. would hit. To hit the country in this sense of a military context, it means to strike. So to strike with military power. So what kind of strike that is, I'm not sure whether it's through what type of force they're using, but military force or power. The U.S. would probably expresses 70 to 80% likely, but not 100%. So still 20 to 30% unlikely. Would probably hit the country again on Wednesday evening. So notice your preposition on. You have Wednesday, but it could be morning, afternoon, evening. As a replacement to evening, you can also say night on Wednesday evening. And renewed his threat. Okay. So just like if you renew your license, it means that, or your, let's say your credit card, you have an expiration date for your credit card. Let's say it's tomorrow. So then you have to renew your credit card. So the expiration date is further. So here though, he's not renewing a credit card. He's renewing his threat. So he's making his threat active again. Just like if your credit card is expired or your license is expired, it's not active. So if you renew it, it becomes active again. So his threat was not active. And we already learned what threat is. If you don't give me a promotion, I'll quit. That's an example of a threat. If you don't do X, I'll Y. And Y is something that would cause you harm or difficulty or some sort of negative emotion. So that's renew his threat, make his threat active again. And here's the threat: to take control of the strategic Karg Island in the Strait of Hormuz. A move. So here, a move in a political context or business context, or even in your own life, it's a strategic decision. So a move that could provoke Iran to hit, again, military strike, to hit energy installations across the Gulf states. So if something provokes Iran, it means it causes Iran to do that action. He later tempered his remarks. His remarks are the words that he said. Now, he being Donald Trump, because that was our last subject. Now, he tempered his remarks. It means he made his remarks sound less strong. So, Donald Trump said the U.S. would probably hit the country again. That sounds quite strong. And renewed his threat. Again, that sounds quite strong. So if he tempered his remarks, it means he made it less strong. He later tempered his remarks, saying he did not think a return to full-scale war was likely and that the fighting would be over quickly. So he made the action sound less severe. So he did not think a return to full-scale war. So here, full-scale means when their fighting was at the strongest, full-scale war, rather than one hit. Remember, a military attack, one hit, in one instance is not a full-scale war. Was likely, and that the fighting would be over quickly. Here, temper is a verb, is conjugated in the past simple, tempered, tempered. It is very commonly used, especially in this context. In a more formal context, you might be advised to temper your remarks. If you're making a speech or giving a formal presentation, in everyday conversations, it would be very common to use the verb to soften. So soften is the base verb, to soften, and then softened is the past simple. He softened his remarks. And instead of remarks, you could use words or comments, message even. So this would be very common. Let's say you're going to talk to your child about their behavior and you think of one way of saying it, and then your partner says, "Ooh, you should soften that. You should soften that. You should make it sound less strong, less severe." So this is a more everyday verb, and this is a more formal verb. Let's keep reading. The U.S. began another wave of strikes. So just think of waves in an ocean. There's one, and then it's not over, right? There's another, and another, and another. So that's the image that you can have. Not necessarily that the strikes, which is a military hit, not that it's never ending, like the waves in the ocean never end, but it's not just one. It sounds like it happens for a period and then potentially stops, and then happens for a period and then potentially stops, just like a wave in the ocean. The U.S. began another wave of strikes on Iran on Wednesday night. So here, notice they used night, like I explained, as a replacement to, what was the word previously I explained that night replaces? Evening. Evening sounds a little more formal than night. On Wednesday evening, on Wednesday night, with military officials saying in a social media post that the action was intended to further degrade Iran's ability to threaten freedom of navigation in the strait. Okay, so freedom of navigation in the strait. But this is to degrade. If something degrades, it means it becomes less powerful. The ability in it becomes less strong. And the ability is for Iran to threaten freedom of navigation in the strait. So for Iran to dictate, to say, yes, you can go through the strait, no, you cannot go through the strait. That would be Iran threatening freedom of navigation, because without that, then people or boats, ships, vessels just move freely through the strait. That would be freedom of navigation. So the military strike, the wave of strikes was intended, so the purpose of it was to prevent Iran from restricting movement in the strait. Let's keep reading. Iran announced earlier on Wednesday that it was implementing a new strategic and military doctrine in which it would make no distinction between the U.S. and its allies in the region, a reference to the Gulf state. So that its allies in the region, this is the reference to the Gulf states. Let's take a look at this phrase. It would, so it being Iran, would make no distinction between, and then we have the U.S. and then its allies. So we can think of the U.S. as X and its allies as Y, or A, B, whatever you're comfortable with. So to make no distinction between A, B means A is the same as B. So you're going to treat them equally to make no distinction. This is a more formal phrase, but you will see it in anything that has a formal policy or law. In a workplace, for example, the company makes no distinction. So make is your verb. You have to conjugate it with the subject. Our subject is the company, it. So that's why there's an S here, because it's in the present simple. The company makes no distinction between, and then we need A, B. So A is full-time employees, B, part-time employees. So they're treated equally. They're treated the same. And this is important when determining healthcare benefits or pension or vacation time. The company makes no distinction between full-time employees and part-time employees. Unfortunately, in this context, it has a more negative implication, because it means that when Iran is launching a military strike, it will strike the US and others in the Gulf state equally. Iran as a country will not give any special treatment to others in the Gulf state. Let's keep reading. The hostilities were the latest in a string of ceasefire violations. So interesting, because here they're using a string of, but you could also use a wave of to remember. A wave, it's like this. So it's a series. So a string of is also a series. I don't have a visual reference for you, but a string of is also a series of. So a wave of, a string of, a series of ceasefire violations. So a violation is the ceasefire said you must do A, and they did not do A. So that would be a violation. But it wasn't just one, it was a string of, so a series of, one after the other, or at least more than one, by the two sides. So not just one, by the two sides, Iran and the US, despite a truce. So a truce is an agreement to stop whatever the negative action is. So in this case, it would be military strikes. A truce between two siblings could be that they will not steal each other's desserts anymore. So in that everyday context of two brothers or sisters, then obviously the consequences of it are very different, but the same thing applies. I agree I won't steal your dessert. You agree you won't steal my dessert. Okay, it's a truce. And then in North American culture, we generally shake at the end of an agreement. So it's a truce, and then we agree. Despite a truce. So they're saying if despite means that you don't consider it. So they had that formal agreement that they would not strike each other, but now they are. So that would be the violations. Despite a truce that came into effect. So that started in April. And the Memorandum of Understanding signed last month. So the Memorandum of Understanding, this was an official document that identified how the two parties will behave. And it was only signed last month. Signed represents that they formalized it. The memorandum, so that's the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, just using the short form. The memorandum was supposed to trigger at least 60 days of phased negotiations. So trigger would mean that it causes it to happen. At least 60 days of phased negotiations that were to end in an agreement of Iran's nuclear program. That were to end in. Were to do something. So this is our verb to be in the past simple. To end. It means that it was supposed to. So that was the intent of it. That were to end in an agreement on Iran's nuclear program and a permanent end to hostility. So hostilities represents the fighting and of course the military strikes, but it can also just be the verbal fighting between the two countries as well, including a ceasefire in Lebanon. So this is one of the hostilities that would end. Let's keep reading. An agreement on the long-term future management of the strait, including whether to impose fees on commercial shipping and on the lifting of U.S. sanctions, was proposed. Okay, so here, notice the grammar of was proposed. Was is singular. It was proposed. But we have multiple things here. But if you look back at the subject, is actually an agreement. That's the subject. It was proposed. The agreement includes multiple things, but the subject is an agreement singular. An agreement was proposed. An agreement on the long-term future management of the strait. So the long-term future management, who is going to manage the strait in the next 5, 10, 15, 20? I don't know how long-term they are looking at. Is long-term for them 5 years or 50 years? And that's the thing. Long-term doesn't have a set time. It's based on the speaker and the context. When you're planning your long-term goals, it might be different from a company planning its long-term goals, for example. So in this case, long-term future management of the strait, I'm not sure. It could be 10 years, could be 50, 200 years, including whether to impose fees on commercial shipping. So this is part of the management of the strait. So this isn't introducing a new subject. This is part of the agreement. And this part is the management of the strait. So should we, if whether to impose, so should we or should the strait impose fees? If you impose a fee, it means that the customer or the person using the service is required to pay it. So impose fees on commercial shipping. So here, the commercial vessels are the ones who are required to pay the fee because the management imposed the fee. The management made it required. But they're wondering, should the strait impose fees on commercial shipping. But notice, an agreement on the long term and on. That preposition is being repeated because it's an agreement on the long-term future management and agreement on the lifting of U.S. sanctions. So the lifting is the removal of U.S. sanctions. So you can impose a sanction, which means you make it a requirement, and then you can remove the sanction or you can lift the sanction. The verb lift is commonly used specifically with sanctions. Let's keep reading. The U.S. Treasury also revoked a temporary sanctions waiver for Tehran. If they revoke it, it means they take it back. So it was active and now it's inactive. Also revoked a temporary sanctions waiver. So what was active? A waiver, meaning that the sanction still existed, but the waiver removed the sanction for Tehran to export oil. So a waiver is to remove something in a specific case. So the specific case is for Tehran to export oil, but then they revoked it. They took it away. They made it inactive. It does not exist anymore, which means Tehran cannot export oil, at least with the US. One of the few tangible benefits Iran had from the MOU. What was the MOU? The Memorandum of Understanding. So here they're using the acronym MOU. You could also just use the first word, the memorandum, from the memorandum. And you do that once you set it the full way the first time. Subsequent times, future times, you can use either the acronym or just the first word, depending on your preference or requirement from whoever is publishing the article. Let's look at this last part. One of the few tangible benefits. Tangible means real. Something that actually provides value to Iran. Yes, there were many other things in the MOU, but this is where they actually receive value. So that's why they're using tangible. In an everyday context, you might just say real benefit, a practical benefit. In a more business context, you would use tangible, or measurable would be another common word. One of the few. But the few, it means that few means small amount. So I think 3 to 5. So this isn't the only one because they said one of the few. So maybe 3 to 5, a small number of real benefits Iran had from the MOU. And that's the end of the article. So now I'll read the article from start to finish and you can focus on my pronunciation. Trump says Iran talks will continue, but ceasefire is over. Iran and the U.S. have threatened to reignite their conflict after the most extensive exchange of fire since an interim deal was signed last month. On a chaotic day at the NATO summit in Ankara, Donald Trump said the U.S. would probably hit the country again on Wednesday evening and renewed his threat to take control of the strategic Karg Island in the Strait of Hormuz, a move that could provoke Iran to hit energy installations across the Gulf states. He later tempered his remarks, saying he did not think a return to full-scale war was likely and that the fighting would be over quickly. The U.S. began another wave of strikes on Iran on Wednesday night, with military officials saying in a social media post that the action was intended to further degrade Iran's ability to threaten freedom of navigation in the strait. Iran announced earlier on Wednesday that it was implementing a new strategic and military doctrine in which it would make no distinction between the U.S. and its allies in the region, a reference to the Gulf states. The hostilities were the latest in a string of ceasefire violations by the two sides, despite a truce that came into effect in April and the Memorandum of Understanding signed last month. The memorandum was supposed to trigger at least 60 days of phased negotiations that were to end in an agreement of Iran's nuclear program and a permanent end to hostilities, including a ceasefire in Lebanon. An agreement on the long-term future management of the strait, including whether to impose fees on commercial shipping, and on the lifting of U.S. sanctions was proposed. The U.S. Treasury also revoked a temporary sanctions waiver for Tehran to export oil, one of the few tangible benefits Iran had from the MOU. Do you want to keep learning English with the news? If you do, put yes, 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 put yes, yes, yes in the comments below. And of course, make sure you like this lesson, share it with your friends, and subscribe so you're notified every time I post a new lesson. And you can get this free speaking guide where I share 6 tips on how to speak English fluently and confidently. You can click here to download it or look for the link in the description. And here's another lesson I know you'll love. Watch it now.